Hello and welcome to the very first episode of Swish Money Live. I am here today. I am the host today. My name is Jeff Welpley, and I'm here today with Tim. And we started this video cast to talk about a lot of the budgeting topics that we discuss on a daily basis and dive in deep to some really interesting areas that I think will help all of you watching. And first up, we're going to be talking today and focus on debt. That's one area that is a major area of focus with budgeting. And we're going to get into some of the tips and tricks around what you can do if you are in debt, how to avoid being in debt, what is debt in the first place. So we're going to dive into all of that. But first, let me give a kind of overview of how this is going to work, and I'm sure it's going to evolve over time. But this is a live video cast. So if you are watching this, we will be doing this every single week, usually on Wednesday, but it'll probably change a little bit. You can find on swish.com, we'll publish the times and on our Swish Money channel on YouTube. And basically, if you want to join us live, you'll be able to ask us questions right in person and any of the guests that we have. And then you can also watch the recording afterwards on our Swish Money channel on YouTube. And that's just some of the logistics. We're going to cover one topic each week. And we'll also talk about stuff that's in the news, some of our own picks and other things that are happening. But before we dive into all of that, let's actually get a little bit, just a couple minutes of quick background on Tim and myself. So Tim, why don't you go first and kind of tell a little bit about your background and who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, my name is Tim Netzel. I lead the product design team here at Swish, and I've been a UX designer and product guy for about a decade at this point. I've worked in a number of startups around Boston. And I guess, it's probably helpful to talk a little bit about money and my experience with it. So, I think one of the interesting things for me personally is that, my parents definitely emphasized budgeting growing up, and sort of being strict about those things. And the thing that I noticed personally is coming right out of college that those lessons didn't necessarily take. I definitely struggled to spend within my means. And while I didn't get into a whole lot of debt, and we can talk about that a little bit later, I definitely felt like, even though I was earning what I think was a totally reasonable salary at the time, I definitely felt like I was still living paycheck to paycheck. And I think that's something that we're hearing from a lot of the people we talk to, a lot of new Swish users, is that even when they're making, in some cases, very large salaries, they're still living paycheck to paycheck. So that's something I'm kind of really excited to talk about and dig into during the course of this video cast.
Great. Thanks, Tim. To give background on myself, like I said, my name is Jeff Welpley. I'm the CTO at Swish. I worked in startups just like Tim for a while, a number of different startups, but actually I spent 8 years in California working for Wells Fargo in one of their auto lending divisions, and spent a lot of time in finance. Like Tim, I have a lot of personal stories around my own finances, and something that drew, I think, both of us to Swish in the first place. Also, actually, as far as the podcast go, this is my second go around running a podcast. I actually used to run a technical one called Angular Air for a while, and was really a lot of fun and great. And it's still out there. My good friend Justin Schwarzenberger is the host there now. So hopefully he's watching this and will continue to do so. So that's it for the background for Tim and myself. And we're going to have guests every week and other panel members and that type of thing. So you'll see a mix of different people as we kind of go forward. But to get started, before we dive into the main topic, I do want to have kind of a section in the podcast where we talk a little bit about, just interesting stuff that in general that's kind of in the news and things that have been happening. And Tim, I don't know if you have any links, but I have a couple ones that were kind of interesting that I saw here. And these are just kind of general budgeting things that, just to be aware of, and or just tidbits and that type of thing. And so one thing that was kind of funny that I saw is that there's this article that I'm going to have link in the show notes that talks about Jay-Z's latest album is actually a lesson on personal finance. Now, Tim, I love me some Yeezy. So this immediately drew me in. And actually, it was really interesting to see that they went into like a lot of his lyrics. And Jay-Z is a businessman. He runs a huge enterprise, and his whole story is actually super interesting. Like beyond his actual music, it's really interesting to see kind of how he came up and really built himself into being a businessman and building this kind of empire. And he really, in his most recent book and a lot of his lyrics, really tries to help the community and help push the idea of becoming financial freedom and kind of taking ownership over your own finances. So definitely check out this link, and which I'll have in the show notes, and it's definitely interesting. Tim, did you have anything?
Yeah. I think one of the things that I've seen a couple of different takes on this that I think are interesting, but I keep seeing articles about how U.S. consumer spending is skyrocketing, and savings rates are at an all-time low. Or at least a 10-year low. It's interesting. The articles seem to have slightly different takes on which of those two facts it is. But I think that's one of the things that I just find fascinating, is that it seems like we as a country at least are getting worse and worse at sort of our own personal financial management, and our financial health is suffering. So I think one of the things that I'm excited to talk about is ways to combat that, and success strategies that seem to be working. I think in positive news, I've also been seeing some articles float around, and we'll share both of these in the podcast notes, about how millennials seem to be doing a significantly better job than a lot of other groups at saving, and how a large group of millennials actually have over $100,000 saved, which for a group that's on average younger than 25 is really impressive. So I think we can talk a little bit more about that as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I definitely think there is some generational aspects to some of that, for sure, of what people have went through. Who lived through the financial, the kind of housing crisis and that type of thing, and how it kind of impacted your thinking on savings. I think that has a big impact. So that's interesting. Last link here that I have is Kiplinger's personal finance car insurance rates are heading higher. Now, this article actually is great, and I picked it out because it intersects two of my interests, personal finance as well as AI. And AI, because a lot of the reason, and AI and technology, and the reason that the article kind of supposes or presupposes that a lot of the insurance rates are going higher is there's more accidents, there's more distracted drivers, because different technologies in a car that are kind of drawing people's attention. And I can tell you from years on the 405 in California, probably like 40 to 50% of the other cars that people are, playing on their iPhones or whatever while they're like going like 60 to 80 miles per hour. It's pretty insane. So that brings up AI because, there is this big push, and this is kind of a little bit off topic and of the kind of just personal finance stuff. But I think this touches on, the reason why, eventually these kind of like self-driverless cars and stuff like that, I think will make an impact, is that at the end of the day, they're going to do a better job, like on average, statistically speaking, than humans. And that's probably even becoming more so because of all these distractions and that type of thing. But the personal finance message here is just to realize that insurance rates are going up. Just to be aware of that, especially if you are planning on buying a car soon or getting new insurance. So, okay, let's dive straight into the main topic for today in debt. Is, and this may seem obvious at first, but I think it actually has more depth than people might think. Debt.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think the way I think about debt, and probably the way most people think about debt, is when you have a financial obligation to pay someone else money, presumably with interest. And so that can take a lot of different forms, whether that's credit card debt, so you've bought a bunch of stuff on your credit card, and you need to pay it back, and they charge you interest every month. Or a mortgage is a form of debt. Student loans are certainly a form of debt. So that's how I think about debt, and probably the most straightforward definition. But I think the thing that's interesting there is the different ways that people get into debt. So maybe we should talk a little bit about that, Jeff.
Sure, yeah. I mean, keep going. What do you think are some of the main ways?
Yeah, so I think the three that I mentioned are really the ones that sort of come to mind. I know a lot of younger folks are graduating school with just mountains of debt. And that can be particularly challenging because a lot of times what happens is someone goes to an expensive private school. They get, their tuition is $50K a year. So they can come out of school with, in some cases, upwards of $200,000 in debt. And oftentimes graduate and go into a job that is not all that lucrative. And so that can kind of feel crushing, and I think, having one of those types of jobs with a sort of lower bracket salary also tends to lead to a decent amount of credit card debt. Most of your cash might go towards rent, and it becomes kind of increasingly hard to make ends meet. And so people end up putting things like, groceries and utilities, anything that they can charge to a credit card on that credit card. And, as soon as you miss one payment or a little bit late, things start to pile up. And then the third one, which I think is at least oftentimes, especially after the housing crisis, a little bit more deliberate, is mortgage debt. And most people, I think, find that they don't have mountains of cash on hand, and so they take out a mortgage when they want to buy a house, which is oftentimes a good financial decision. It's if it's something that you plan for, and it's within your means, you can save money compared to renting. In some cases, that's not the case. So I think it's really interesting to sort of unpack that one as well.
Yeah, I mean, one thing with what you're saying that's probably important to point out is that it isn't that debt is evil. I think that, well, first of all, a majority of Americans have some form of debt, and it is a normal part of life because there are things that we want and or need to pay for, and we don't have the money now. So you need to be able to borrow it. I mean, that's like a key part of our economic system, and has been, for a long time. And so, you brought up some of the big ones there, Tim, between housing and school and that type of thing. I guess the part where it becomes bad is when, you manage that debt. So you take on so much that the interest payments are overwhelming, and it then spirals out of control. And actually, so I guess there's a couple of questions there, but what do you think are some guidelines? Like, we could talk about in a minute, once people are in debt and how to get out of it, but let's first talk about like just tips of how do people avoid this in the first place? Like, how do people make sure they have manageable debt?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeff. And I'll say this. I think probably the easiest distinction to draw is between planned debt and unplanned debt, on the other hand. And so whether that's a mortgage, that you've clearly deliberately planned for, and you know how much you're going to be paying both in interest and in principal every month, and you know that that combined payment is manageable, so that you're always paying down the debt. I think that is totally reasonable. I'll share actually a personal story here too. Near the end of my first startup, I made a deliberate decision for about 6 months to rack up a small amount of credit card debt. And I think that's interesting, because people, when you hear credit card debt, people's eyes always kind of widen, and it's, sort of this taboo topic. And I think a lot of people always consider it just blanket statement horrible. Like, you don't ever do that. And generally I agree with them, but I think sometimes when it's planned and it's deliberate and you know that you'll be able to pay it off, that's kind of a different story. And so I had a plan for how long I was willing to do that, what the absolute limit was for me that I wasn't going to go above, and knew exactly how I was going to pay it down, and basically was able to pay it off entirely in 3 months. And so, I felt comfortable making that choice. But I think that's very different than the typical story with a lot of people in credit card debt, where what happens is it kind of sneaks up on you. It's not a deliberate choice. It's the result of, kind of a bunch of different problems compounding, maybe losing a job, or having unexpected medical bills or something like that, where all of a sudden you either have less income or you have more expenses than you planned for. And combining that with the fact that you don't necessarily have any kind of safety net. So I think to answer your question directly, the two pieces of advice I have are, number one, plan for it. And if you're going to get in debt, make sure it's planned debt. And to help avoid getting in debt in the first place, have that sort of 6-month savings put away so that you can live 6 months without any income, or you can handle an unexpected medical bill. And I know, especially for folks who are a little bit younger, you're like, oh, that's not going to happen to me. And I definitely have felt that way in the past, and even find myself feeling that way now. But believe me, it does happen. I have a friend who unexpectedly had an accident and ended up paralyzed, and now has significant financial challenges because of that. Had to take a significant amount of time off of work, had to spend a lot of time in the hospital and in rehab, and all of those things cost a lot of money, and I know that he is very, very grateful for having socked some money away, and also having friends and family who are extremely generous and helpful. But not everybody has that sort of network safety net, and so I think the best thing you can do personally is make sure you've saved some money. And my recommendation, which is pretty common, is to save at least 6 months worth of salary, and this should be the first savings goal that you have. Before retirement, before saving for a house or anything else, save at least 6 months of salary, so that if something happens, if you lose a job, if you have an accident or something else, you need to help a family member, you can do that and still be in good shape.
Yeah, one thing that's interesting, Tim, with what you're saying is that a necessary predecessor for doing exactly what you're suggesting, which I think is right, trying to only have planned debt. And one of the necessary predecessors is creating a budget. I mean, that's going to be a common theme, I think, of this video cast, really. But No, seriously, because you can't actually, there's no way you can accurately plan your debt unless you have a handle on knowing what your bills are, what your expenses are, you know, what types of things you want to save for and that type of thing. So I think it probably the even, you know, first part is create, you know, budget, even if it's in a small form, and it doesn't have to be complex at first. It can be, you know, simple one, but just because then you can and debt by saying like, yes, I can handle this interest payment as part of my expenses, you know, for the month. So that's I'm sure that theme will come back many times in the our future.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Jeff. You know, one of the things I always tell people is control your spending, and I think the interesting thing is I think about it probably a little bit differently than other people do, and I read a lot about this on Quora, and maybe we'll throw some links into some of the questions that people are asking on Quora in the podcast notes as well. But I kind of break it down into 3 steps, and the first one, and this is, you know, shameless plug, totally you know, connected to the way we've built the Swish app and the philosophy behind it. But the first tip is to know your sort of free to spend number. And that's basically the amount of money you can spend on discretionary things every month. So, you know, the way you calculate that is you take your post-tax salary number, you know, the amount of money you get in your paycheck every month. And for simplicity, let's say that's $5,000. And then you subtract your monthly bills. So your things like rent or a mortgage, cable and internet, phone, you know, the stuff you pay every single month regularly, that is more or less the same amount. And then you subtract the amount you want to save every month. So, you know, that's really deliberate that happens first. You're planning for savings. And so, you know, let's say you want to save $1,000 every month. So you take that out of there as well. And then the remaining amount, so in this case, I think it's $2,500. You have 5,000 minus 1,500 minus 1,000. That $2,500 is the amount you have free to spend on discretionary items this month. And it's a little bit interesting because at least in my case, I consider even things like groceries as discretionary. And that's not to say that like it's discretionary for you to choose to eat or not eat. That's definitely not the case, but you can definitely choose to sort of stretch that grocery budget more, and slim down on those expenses, or you can choose to go to Whole Foods or, you know, somewhere a little bit higher end. And so, you know, what I found is basically knowing how much you have free to spend every month and how much on average per day you can spend makes things a lot easier, right? So if you know in general you can spend as much as $83 per day in this case, it's just that 2,500 divided by 30. That makes it a lot simpler to say like, okay, like I'm going to the grocery store, I'm gonna try to stay under $83. Or, you know, if you have a family, that's, you know, $83 would, you know, not be realistic for a family of 4 for like a week's worth of groceries. You can say, all right, like, you know, maybe I double that or triple that. But then I'm going to make sure that I don't have too many expenses the next couple of days. And then the next step is to actually track your spending, right? So your goal is to stay below that free to spend monthly number. And to do that, you basically have to know how much you're spending day in and day out. And so you can do that by adding up your transactions from your bank accounts and credit cards every day and putting those in a spreadsheet. You can use the Swish app, which is free and kind of does that automatically. We'll scan your bank accounts and make that calculation for you. But either way, what you're really trying to do is, you know, kind of have that fuel gauge where, you know, all right, I started the month at 2,500. You know, now it's sort of counting down. I'm at 1,500 today, and I have, you know, half the month left or whatever. So I'm on track. That's okay. Like if I want to go treat myself today, that's totally fine. Or, you know, I'm a little bit ahead of schedule. You know, probably, you know, maybe I won't get that coffee or buy those jeans today or whatever it is. And that I find is a whole lot easier than sort of trying to live like a monk or a hermit. Rather than saying like, oh, I'm just going to cut everything and, I'm never going to treat myself to anything. You're really just owning your financial decisions. And that seems to work a whole lot better for people because you form this daily habit. It only takes 15 seconds a day if you're using the Swish app. It'll take a few minutes if you're doing it manually. But that seems to form a habit, because if you're really trying to just like cut all of these items, you're never going to stick with it, right? Like, if you absolutely love coffee, you're not going to give up going out and getting coffee, for like 90 days, right? You might make it a week or two, but you're going to fall off the bandwagon, right? But if you, on the other hand, are sort of in charge of your expenses, it's easy to say, all right, well, I'm not going to get any coffee today. But once the month starts over, I can get a coffee again. And so we found that this kind of process, whether it's manual or through the Swish app, really, really works. People just sort of stick with it. And at least for me personally, it's sort of totally transformed my relationship with money. I'm saving far more than I ever did. And I feel good about it because I know where my money's going, and I don't feel like I am having to cut too much. I'm just saying like, okay, like, you know what, I'm not going to do that today.
It makes sense. Yeah, actually, it's funny you bring up coffee and that type of thing, because definitely I used to go every single day, at least once a day, to Starbucks to get chai, tea latte. That was my Achilles heel. But now, as you can kind of see here, I make my own tea and bring it in, and I still go sometimes, like you were saying, Tim. But it like on a daily basis, it's just crazy. Like there's no reason to go like twice a day to Starbucks for their $6, $7 coffees. I mean, it's insane. So yeah, I totally agree with you. Okay, now let's get to kind of the meat of this episode, which is because at the end of the day, we're going to find ourselves in debt. Everybody does from time to time. What do we do about it once we're there? What are some hacks, some tips, some tricks of dealing with the debt once we have it? I think that there are a lot of kind of different approaches to this, but one thing that I think is important to maybe kick off the discussion on this is that does have to be kind of a general understanding that not all debt is the same. And then a lot of the tips and tricks are kind of based off of understanding this concept that debt means that you owe money, obviously, but that's not if you owe money and you don't have to pay any interest on it, then it's not a problem. It's all about the interest rate. That's, at the end of the day, the amount that you're paying for that debt is the problem, and that's the issue, and that's what you're trying to deal with. So, Tim, why it helps to understand before we maybe even dive into the actual tips and tricks. Why are there different interest rates? Why isn't all debt the same interest rate, or why isn't it all zero? Why is one 2% versus 20% versus whatever?
Yeah, great question. So I'm going to answer the second half of that question first. Why isn't it all zero? And the answer is because banks want to make money, and they want to make money off of you. But in general, interest rates are set based on the bank's sort of perceived risk, and sort of on the lifetime of that loan, right? So credit cards, for example, have a pretty high risk of default, of people sort of never paying that money back. And so credit card debt tends to have the highest interest rate, usually between 15 and in some cases 20+%. And so as far as, what you should pay down first, if you've got multiple forms of debt, it's pretty much always credit card debt. Now there are exceptions to that. Credit cards lately, they do like zero interest for a year or something like that. And so if you've got any form of credit card debt, it's really important to know what your interest rate is now, and how that might transform in the future. But that's the reason that there are different rates of debt, you know, for the most part. And there's also, you know, sort of variables around the economy that, you know, particularly impact mortgages. And Jeff, I know you've got a mortgage, so maybe you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, it's good you brought that up, because I have I just had written down a couple of my own like personal things that I've actually used, some tricks and tips and hacks or whatever for managing debt. And so, you know, one of them is you know, refinancing your. You can do it anytime technically. You want to monitor what the current rate is. It doesn't always work out because there are fees. So that's the key calculation. You have to kind of like factor into that. And honestly, it's not always clear how much those fees are going to be always. So definitely be careful about that. But I think it's just off the top of my head, I think we ended up paying like, you know, something like $5,000 in fees. Does that sound about right, Tim? I feel like it was something around there. So, you know, in essence, whatever the difference between the current rate that you'll be able to get and your rate, like let's say it's less, the money that you save needs to kind of be more than what that fee is to make it worth your while. But I mean, other than that, like you technically could refinance like every day of the week or whatever. I mean, it takes more time, so you can't do that. But every year, let's say, and you should be doing that. So if you have a mortgage, always keep an eye on the interest rate. Like, actually, it might be good to even pre-calculate in your mind, like know ahead of time what the interest rate has to drop to before you go and refinance. And then kind of the only trick then would be is if you think it's going to like drop down a little bit more and you want to wait an extra, you know, week or two or something like that. So there's a little bit of a game there, but refinancing is one big one. Another one is Tim mentioned, you know, credit card debt. Definitely agree. Pay off that first. One thing you have to be careful of, but you can do, is if you own a house and you do have extra equity, you can potentially do a line of credit. There are some risks with this. So, you know, namely that the reason why they give you a much lower interest rate for a line of credit than, you know, credit card, let's say, is that it is an asset-backed loan, which means that they put a lien on your house, and if you do not pay it, they can take your house. So you have risk now, and I mean, that's the reason why you're able to get lower interest rate. But as you know, so you should obviously plan ahead and make sure that you can handle it and that you aren't at risk of defaulting and that type of thing. But if so, that is a way of kind of managing that debt. If you have a credit card, like let's say, you know, 10,000 or whatever, and you want to kind of roll that into you know, a line of credit, that's an option at least you should look into. And then the last one I have is that actually Tim quickly mentioned that some credit cards have a 0% interest rate. Again, there's risks with this to you personally as well, because in general, opening up new credit does a soft, I forget what it's called, like a soft hit on your credit report. Like basically, if you do it too much, your credit rating will go down. So I do not suggest doing this if you plan on trying to get like a mortgage. Like if you're going to get a mortgage in the next you know, foreseeable near future or whatever, because it might lower your credit rating. But if you just started a mortgage and you don't think that's going to happen, and you have a little bit of debt and you think you're going to be able to pay it off in that year period during the 0% interest, and that's at least an option that could work as like a little hack. You're going to see?
Yeah, you know, one other thing I was going to add to that, Jeff, specifically on the point of credit card debt is, you know, what I really recommend and my strategy when I kind of deliberately, like I said earlier, took on some credit card debt for a couple of months, is if you're in that situation, it's time to at least think about the sort of survival budget. And the idea behind the survival budget is that you're literally only spending money on the absolute necessities, you know, rent, you know, utilities, and like basic food. And if that sounds a little bit Spartan, that's because it is. But that's okay, right? If we're talking about like a month or 3 months, you can do it. If you're talking about permanently and there's no end in sight, that's where things get hard. But I think that, what I think we've seen with human nature in general is that pretty much anyone can tolerate pretty much anything for a month, right? Or 3 months. And so if you're struggling to sort of crack that, that debt, that's what I really recommend first, is just like for a month or even for a week, just to, reduce your expenses, and use that money to pay off the interest and off the principal. Cut things for a little bit, find a way to do it. It'll, it might be a little bit painful at first, but you will feel a whole lot better afterwards.
Yeah, that makes sense. I definitely would not suggest doing the survival budget for more than a short time period, though. But yeah, definitely. Actually, one last one that I have that I was just thinking about is that, and this actually isn't necessarily a tip for getting out of your debt, but more something to be aware of when you are in debt. Like, so I had a discussion with my wife at one point, which you typically, when we're on different sides of an argument, I'm always wrong. Like, and I'm serious. Like I am, like, I think I'm right, but then I realized at the end of the day, like, I was just being an idiot. So this was one of those many occasions that I was thinking along the lines of what we've been talking about, that, the right thing to do is always to consolidate your debt to the lowest interest rate. It doesn't make sense to, like, I was arguing, for example, instead of saving, like, if we had extra money, to save it in a savings account that's like only a 0.5% that you gain in the savings account, but then you have a credit card debt for X amount. Like, you shouldn't even bother savings, and you should just pay off the credit card debt. At least that's what I was thinking. But the two things to be aware of there is that, first of all, that you always should have savings. Like, so even though it's important to pay off credit card debt and to be aggressive about paying off your debt, there's always emergencies that come up, and you need cash on hand to pay for it. But then also, even when you talk about like a line of credit, for example, where you actually can technically pull cash back out if you need it, the problem with anything other than your kind of savings account is how liquid it is. Like, there is a certain amount that you should always have as your emergency fund. Like, to paying off your debt, I think you would agree, Tim, is having, an emergency fund, because you might be really good about paying off your debt, but if you have an emergency need and you don't have cash on hand, then you're sunk. So I know you have a lot of thoughts on this, and so I'll leave the last word on this discussion to you.
Yeah, I definitely agree, Jeff. But I would say that there's some caveats there. So, like, the way I think about it is, right, like I said earlier, the typical recommendation is to have 6 months of salary saved, so that you can cover 6 months of expenses if you lose your job. And usually that amount suffices if you've got health insurance, if to sort of cover you if something, if you have an accident or something happens and you have to take time off work. But in the case where you have credit card debt, you definitely want to be focused on paying that off. But like you said, you do still have, some risk there. And so the way I think about it then is, instead of having 6 months worth of salary, to have saved 6 months worth of the cash expenses that you have, like the things that you can't put on a credit card. So in my case, that's pretty much only rent, and like my utility bills, like not even cable and internet, just like electric, because everything else I can charge to a credit card, and presumably would kind of already be on that credit card debt end of the spectrum. But like, you don't want to be out on the street, obviously. So you at least need to sort of have that savings, in place. But pretty much right after you hit that, you should be paying off that credit card debt. So that's how I think about it.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, definitely. Cool. All right. That was a great discussion. Now let's get to the final part of, every week at the very end, we're going to have our picks. And so, Tim, you might not know what this is. We didn't necessarily talk about it ahead of time. So it's cool if you don't have one for this week, but picks usually where it's just like blatant promotions, anything you want kind of audience to check out, in addition to it could be random, whatever. It could be, some AI topic or whatever. And so I'll let you go first, and then I have a couple myself.
Oh, all right. Definitely in the hot seat. Since I didn't know we were doing picks. But yeah, I will. I'll pick a couple of things. Shameless self-promotion. Check out the conversations that are going on Quora. I think people are asking some really interesting questions, and I'm answering them, but also there are a lot of other smart folks answering questions about personal finances, particularly about saving money and getting out of debt. So we'll throw a link in the podcast notes on that. So that's one of my picks. And my other pick is going to be, if you haven't checked out Swish yet, definitely check it out. We kind of describe it as a budgeting app that's so simple that you'll actually use it. And so the whole idea is around simplicity. Once you set it up, which takes maybe 5 minutes, you'll spend 15 seconds every day checking in on your finances, but no more than that. So unlike some of the other apps where you have to spend tons of time categorizing transactions, or you absolutely dread going in there, and so you go in every 15 months rather than every day, or every couple of months rather than every day, and you have to spend 3 hours coming through all of your different transactions. You're just going to spend a few seconds every day. We'll send you a text message or a push notification, and you're off to the races, and you know exactly how much you can spend every day. So those are my two picks.
Cool. Thanks, Tim. For myself, I just published a course that I taught on udemy.com called Budgeting Basics. So we'll include a link to that in the show notes, but it basically goes over some of the stuff that we talked about today, just how to set up your own simple budget. And I put a lot of time into it, so definitely check that out. We're going to be coming out with a lot more kind of educational videos in the coming months.
Free course, right, Jeff?
Yes, free. Thank you, Tim. Cool. Thank you very much for joining us today, and join us next week on Swish Money Live. See ya.